This joins us, retired former Admiral in the United States Navy, former commander of the Allied Supreme Command of NATO and of Southern Command. Good morning, Admiral. How are you this morning?
Doing well, Hugh, down here in Florida. All good.
Well, I've got three stories for you today that I'd love you to get your comment on. In Southern Command days, I would assume Haiti was in your jurisdiction, was it, or was it not?
Of course. And
Okay.
I've been there many, many times.
Well, it's plunged into a constitutional crisis, the latest. Whenever we talk about Haiti, it's never good news, right? And they are having convulsions over whether or not the president is the president. What ought we to do are you following this story, and what ought we to do? Because it seems that Haiti, as one of the commentators in the Washington Post story says, is Somalia in our hemisphere.
I think it is not anywhere near as bad as Somalia. For starters, it doesn't export terrorism the way Somalia does. It's not a base for al-Shabaab, a big Islamic radical terrorist group. So let's keep it in perspective. It is a very unlucky country, and every time Haiti starts to get traction, something bad always happens. And sometimes it's a natural disaster. You'll recall the big earthquake back in 2009 or so. You'll recall the waves of cholera that swept through it. But above all, it has political turmoil, which brings us to the moment. Yes, I'm following this story. They have a president who is claiming that he should be able to stay another year in office because the start of his term got delayed politically. It's a fabricated argument. It has no bearing. Here's what we ought to do. Let me start with what we should not do. We should not intervene militarily in any way. You'll recall, Hugh, we have a long history over the century of intervening in Haiti. It's a bad thing militarily. We ought to go to the Organization of American States. The headquarters is right there in Washington. It's the mini United Nations for the hemisphere. They ought to take this problem on. And by the way, if we need peacekeeping troops, the president is there to send Brazilians and Chileans. That's who was in Haiti keeping the peace after some of these natural disasters. So stay out of it as a unilateral act. Go to the OAS, work it within the hemisphere.
So there is no doubt in your mind that the claim of the incumbent president, who yesterday had 23 people arrested, is an illegitimate claim. And so we need it's always important at the beginning of this to get our moral bearings right. It is the incumbent president who has the illegitimate claim.
That is my view based on what I have seen in press reporting. I have not dived into this one at a classified level. As you know, I still hold a security clearance, but I've seen no classified information. But I've seen nothing in the open press that would, in my view, lend support to his claim or his legitimacy.
Okay, and then if that is the case, we have to actually lean on the OAS to do their job, because we do not want pretenders like Maduro and other places to get legs. I mean, that's how authoritarian regimes begin, is with the initial sin, the original sin.
That's exactly right. And you'll recall around the time you and I were graduating from college in the late 70s, early 80s, otherwise known as 1.2 million years ago. In those days, almost every nation in this hemisphere south of the United States was a dictatorship, normally a military dictatorship. That's been turned around, other than Nicaragua, arguably. Obviously, it has not turned around in Cuba and has not turned around in Venezuela. We don't want to add Haiti to the list of backsliders.
All right, now let's go to the second one. Iran launched a new rocket yesterday. Tehran's new rocket features a key component seen in ICBMs. Right now they have ballistic missiles. They do not have intercontinental ballistic missiles. How significant, and what's it do to the Biden team's approach, do you think, when Secretary Blinken and the president sit down to talk about this?
It is significant, and it really is just about range. You can make the argument, by the way, that some of Tehran's missiles are already intercontinental in that they can reach portions of southeastern Europe from Iran. But let's park that and simply say this is going to increase the range, the accuracy, the lethality of their long suite of missiles. So what it should do, in my view, for the president and for Secretary Tony Blinken, who I know very well, both of them, and I think they will do this, it's a flashing yellow light. It means, hey, let's slow down. And frankly, I have said on your show many times, the last thing in the world we want to do is simply jump back into the old Iran nuclear deal. We ought to go slow. We got to see, for starters, Iran come back in compliance with the deal, and the president has said that, and so has Secretary Blinken. But I would argue, let's not go to Tehran. Let's go to Brussels. Let's get alignment with our allies, and then go collectively to Tehran and renegotiate this deal. And the Iranians are not going to like that. They're going to make a lot of hay out of, hey, you broke an agreement, and et cetera, et cetera. They have elections coming in June, which will complicate all this. My advice is go slow here. Eventually, we're going to have to get a new deal. This is another good indicator that simply jumping back into the old one, not a good idea.
The Post reports, until negotiations start, Iran is racing to build leverage and dissuade any American ambition to curtail its conventional missile program, according to Fabian Hinz, an independent open-source intelligence analyst with expertise in missiles. Quote, this was a very, very clear message by the Iranians that they are advancing and they can build longer-range stuff if they want to. They want to show that if you put pressure on our missiles, we can react. Well, of course they can react. That doesn't mean we don't put pressure on their missiles. Do you think we ought to demand that the missiles be included in any new deal, Admiral?
I would certainly put that up front as one of two major conditions in any deal, in addition to the nuclear. The two new conditions have to be controls on their long-range missile systems, as you just mentioned. And the other one is their activities all around the region, supporting rebels in Yemen, supporting radical elements in the Iraqi political system, their pressure on Hezbollah, which derives pressure onto Israel. So there are two new things, if you will, that we're just going to have to negotiate with the Iranians. And yes, they're trying to build leverage, showing us longer-range missiles. What else are they doing? They just seized a South Korean tanker and have held it now for some weeks on a fake claim of environmental damage. They're going to continue to show they can control the Strait of Hormuz. They can launch long-range missiles. I wouldn't be surprised to see a cyber attack, perhaps against Saudi oil fields. Another drone attack has occurred a year and a half ago against Saudi oil fields. That's their idea of leverage, bad behavior. They're taking a page out of Kim's playbook in North Korea, and it's not smart because it is not going to pay off for them in negotiations.
That was Secretary Pompeo's argument all along, that all we ask them to be is a normal country. They act in ways that no other normal country acts in. So all we want them to do. So if the Biden-Blinken team negotiated on that basis, I wouldn't have an objection to an agreement that got those three things done, because then they'd be a normal regime.
Exactly. And that ought to be the storyline, the narrative that we're taking to Brussels, because if we're going to create the conditions to fulfill that negotiation, we've got to keep also, we haven't mentioned this, economic pressure on the Iranians, and that has got to include Europe. We can't simply continue our sanctions, which we are doing commendably at this moment by the Biden administration, but they're loopy, they're full of holes because the Europeans are willing to trade with the Iranians. So we've got to get the Europeans on side. Then we can negotiate the conditions that you and I just discussed.
Now, last week we talked about Cyber Command. And so this week it is unfortunately the case that we have evidence for why we need it. Hacker changed chemical level in Florida city water system. And I don't know if you've read this about Oldsmar.
Of course.
But, yeah, I mean, how did you react to this? Oldsmar, Florida, the lie level. Who saw that coming?
Yeah, and of course, two disclosures here. One, I'm known often online as Admiral Florida Man.
Yeah.
And I live here. I'm a native. So, yes, I follow Florida closely. And B, disclosure, serious one, I am on the board of American Water, the largest water utility in the country. So I spend a lot of time in this space and a lot of time at board meetings arguing strenuously for cyber protections in our water systems. Think about it, Hugh. We spend a lot of money protecting our electric grid and our natural gas grid, and we should. But here's a news flash. you can live a long time without electricity. You can live a long time without natural gas coming into your home. You can live about 3 days without potable water coming into your house. And we need those kind of protections. And the water industry is vulnerable, just like those other industries, with exactly what happened, chemical imbalances. That's an attempt at poisoning the water. That's extremely severe. But you can also do any number of things to potable water supplies by simply adjusting chemical contents. Won't be poisonous, but it will not be potable.
Well, I am just curious, and let's take American Water out of the equation. Generally speaking, what would you recommend a water company do after they read this story? Because this is a little town in the middle of nowhere. Someone tries to poison it. Doesn't the flare go up over every water company in America?
It absolutely does. And here's a problem. As you may or may not know, our water supplies in America are extremely disaggregated. There are very few large equivalents of the big electric grids that provide our electricity. Most water comes from municipal small facilities that are run for historical reasons by individual towns, counties, little cities. There are very few big companies that have the cyber resources. So my advice for all of those systems is get somebody on your board, and they all have a board, a municipal board, who has some real cyber expertise. Get someone on the board who has law enforcement expertise. Go to the county, go to the state level, and get resources to have them come in and at least look at your basic cyber protections, no matter how small your water treatment plant is, because as we've just seen, it can be a target.